welcome once again. I believe that this second presentation will be exciting for you. For so long, Marxism has critiqued the foundations of the West. Now the time has come for us to consider the foundations of Marxism. Were the atrocities in communism's history an accident, or were they a result of the Marxist ideology? As you listen to Bill's presentation, please decide for yourself.
Marx spoke about the alienation of the laborer from the product of his labor. So we might ask, is the Soviet worker the owner of what he produces? Has he overcome that particular problem of alienation? Of course we know he is not. A new elite has emerged within the Soviet Union. The power, the control of the means of production has been consolidated in the hands of a very few people. In fact, Marx, who used the word capitalism, by capitalism he meant a system where there were a few people who controlled everything and did nothing. And then there were a few people who did everything, did all the work, but had no control, had no ownership. Strictly speaking, although we may use the word capitalism, perhaps carelessly, for Marx it had a very definite meaning. And we don't really find that kind of capitalism anywhere in our world. However, the closest thing to it is what we find in the Soviet Union today, where there are a very small number of people who control not only the means of production, they control the military, they control the entire infrastructure of the country, and they even control the official ideology. So really, the Soviet worker is certainly not the owner of what he produces. This particular elite group, here characterized by Mr. Chernenko, is well-to-do. They're able to shop in special stores where they can buy things from the West. However, in general, the Soviet Union is not characterized by wealth, but rather is characterized by widespread poverty. In his text, USSR in Crisis, Marshall I. Goldman, Associate Director of the Russian Research Center at Harvard University, points out that Russia was formerly the greatest exporter of grain in the world. But under the communist system, Russia has become an importer of grain. Goldman looks at other indicators of economic prosperity, such as the annual rate of growth of the GNP, and he finds that every year the Soviet GNP grows less and less. Under communism, the country is becoming less and less prosperous. This has given rise to a very curious irony. And that is that there are two functioning economies in the Soviet Union. There is the official Marxist-based economy, and there is an underground free market system. In other words, a clandestine free market system without which the country could not sustain itself. In this article, which appeared in Forbes magazine, which Tom mentioned, authors Lawrence Menard and James Michaels point out that the average subsistence wage necessary for a Soviet worker to maintain himself and his family is 210 rubles a month. But the average take-home pay of the Soviet worker is only 171 rubles a month. And because of this, they say, almost every Soviet worker has to maintain a second job, some kind of illegal job participating in this illegal free market that is operating in the Soviet Union. In fact, in the Soviet Union every day, people are committing crimes such as buying, selling, transporting. Things that are just the normal business of the day in the free world are, of course, criminal activities in the Soviet Union, and they are regarded as exploitation of someone else. This gives rise to a situation which is perhaps captured in a little anecdote that I could share with you. There were some Western working men who went over to the Soviet Union and were visiting the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, of course, were very curious about these people from the West. So they were asking some of these workers about their income and things like that. And they said, they asked one particular person, how much do you make a month? And this person said, well, I make about $1,000 a month. And he said, well, how much of that do you need just in order to survive? And he thought, and he said, well, I guess just in order to survive, I need about $800 a month. And so the Soviet worker was surprised. And he said, well, what do you do with all that extra money every month? And the Westerner said, well, actually, where I come from, we don't usually ask that kind of question to a complete stranger. That's sort of a personal affair. He said, how about you? How much do you make a month? And the Soviet said, well, I make 200 rubles a month. And the American said, well, how much do you need just in order to survive? And he said, well, I need about 275 rubles a month. And the American was surprised. He said, well, where do you get that extra 75 rubles every month? And the Soviet said, well, in my country, we don't usually talk about that with a complete stranger. So the fact is, there is an illegal, clandestine, free market system that actually even the Soviet Union couldn't sustain itself without some kind of free enterprise system going on. However, it's strictly illegal. If we're looking for alienation of the laborer from the product of his labor, we're going to find it in its most extreme form, where there's this attempt to apply Marxist principles. Marx talked about the alienation of the laborer from his laboring activity itself. Well, then in that case, does the Soviet worker derive joy and satisfaction from his work? It certainly appears that he doesn't. In fact, we know that the Soviet system is based upon forced labor. In other words, the rulers such as Andropov may come and may exhort the workers to work, may appeal to the workers to work, as he did repeatedly. However, if they don't work, there's ultimately the possibility of being sent to the Gulag, which serves not only as a threat of punishment, but actually serves as an additional supply of cheap or free labor for the society. Furthermore, the Soviet system is characterized by quotas. Quotas for production, quotas for consumption, all different kinds of quotas which very quickly become meaningless. They must be fulfilled. If they're not fulfilled, it's an act against the state. So they have to be fulfilled, at least on paper, even if they're not fulfilled in reality. So they very quickly become meaningless. In fact, in Goldman's book, he talks about various instances of meaningless quotas, such as a particular truck repair facility that was actually built to replace an existing truck repair facility. So the new facility was completed, it was inspected, it was found to be safe from fire, it passed the health inspection, and the trucks that needed repair were diverted from the old plant to the new plant. However, after a number of months, these trucks began to pile up in the parking lot because the new plant didn't exist. It only existed on paper, even though it had been inspected many times. And ultimately, this was even reported in Pravda, and they had to admit and expose their own foolishness in this affair. Ultimately, in a recent report of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, they discussed the question why workers won't work in the Soviet Union. While the Soviet economic malaise has been attributed by various Soviet scholars to different factors, such as lagging investment, flagging work discipline, harder mining conditions, or dry years in agriculture, the conclusion of the Soviet Academy of Science itself is that there lies in the outdated nature of the system of organization and economic management, or simply in the inability of the system to ensure complete and efficient utilization of the workers and of the intellectual potential of the society. The Soviet-style system doesn't mobilize human creativity, doesn't allow for the release of the natural human creativity. In fact, there's a slogan amongst the workers in the Soviet Union reported in this article. There's a saying among the workers, they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work, summing up the situation of the Soviet worker. Other dissidents, such as Mr. Mikhail Makarenko, whom I mentioned, report that it's not just a passive thing. There is an active revolution that has been taking place since 1917 within the Soviet Union. But it's not a military revolution. It's rather a revolution of sabotage. Mr. Makarenko says that the average Soviet worker goes to work every day thinking, what can I do to sabotage the government industry today? What valve can I leave open? What part can I steal and throw in the river? What can I do to just bog down the industrial production of the Soviet Union? That this becomes the expression of discontent. Of course, any sort of organized expression of labor dissatisfaction is harshly repressed. And in the workers' paradise, workers are not allowed to organize and to express their grievances. In short, if we look for alienation of the laborer from his laboring activity, we may find it everywhere, but we will find it in its most extreme form where someone is trying dogmatically to apply Marxist principles. Marx talked about the alienation of the human species, but we may ask, does man find his true human nature in the Soviet system? There are reports of incredible widespread corruption in the Soviet Union. A recent Soviet Academy report says the type of worker that such a system cultivates not only falls short of the needs of developed socialism, but fails to match the requirements of modern production. His common traits are low labor and productive discipline, an indifferent attitude toward work, a shoddy quality of work, social inactivity, a well-pronounced consumer mentality of all things, and a low code of ethics. In this text called USSR, the Corrupt Society, ex-defense attorney for the in the Soviet Union, Konstantin Simis, talks about the widespread corruption found in the Soviet Union. To give you a little flavor of Simis's book, let me just read a couple of paragraphs. Simis talks about the special problem in fighting organized crime in the Soviet Union. He says, the fight against organized crime has always presented major difficulties for any state in whatever political system. In a democratic country such as the United States, the difficulties stem from a respect for legality and the basic principles of justice. The police know the heads of the mafia families and their whereabouts, but they do not have sufficient evidence to submit to a court of law in order that criminal proceedings might be instituted. In a totalitarian state like the Soviet Union, on the other hand, the fight against organized crime encounters quite different obstacles. Obstacles that stem from the fact that crime has practically enveloped the whole country and the entire lower levels of the party-state apparatus. In another point in the book, he writes, although not conceived as such by its creators, this Soviet variety of organized crime naturally is derived from and has become an organic part of the dictatorship of the apparat of the only political party in the country, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Organized crime in the Soviet Union bears the stamp of the Soviet political system, the Soviet economy, and in general, everything that may be lumped together as the Soviet regime. The final passage of Simis's book is this. And now, finishing this book, I ask myself, what next? What is the future of the country? And I answer my own question with bitterness. The Soviet government, Soviet society cannot rid itself of corruption as long as it remains Soviet. It's as simple as that. So, this supposedly sincere application of Marxist principles has done nothing in terms of resolving the problem of how does man find his true human nature. And finally, Marx lamented the separation of man from man. But are the citizen workers of the Soviet Union able to establish fulfilling and joyful human relationships? It's inconceivable that in a society characterized by constant surveillance, even the surveillance of children against their parents, this would be possible. Furthermore, we know the Soviet Union is characterized by elitism and racism. Actually, the Soviet Union is a vast empire, including the Great Russians and many subservient states. And yet, the Politburo is almost a homogeneous group of the same race and a certain elite group which perpetuates itself. Communism is supposed to solve problems of nationalism. And yet, one of the most heavily fortified international frontiers in the world is the international boundary between the Soviet Union and Communist China, two communist countries. Furthermore, probably the most damning evidence against the Soviet system and all the communist countries is the mass exodus which takes place whenever communists come to power. It's said that when the Berlin Wall was being constructed, behind every worker with a shovel was a soldier with a gun. And behind every soldier with a gun was another soldier with a gun. And yet, probably many of you remember the celebrated photo of this soldier who took his chances and ran across when the wall was just a roll of barbed wire. Now the wall is much more than just a wall. In fact, I had the opportunity to visit the city of Berlin last year as a part of a fact-finding tour, and we found the wall is an incredible complex of devices. There's the wall. Behind the wall there are minefields, there are anti-tank traps, there are special sand pits, there are automatic rifle traps that when the wires trip, they'll automatically fire. There are police dogs, and there are even machine gun nests manned by soldiers. It's the most dramatic evidence of the failure of the communist world, the social failure of communism. The fact that literally the communist world is a great prison in which its citizens are retained by force. By the way, you may be aware that the wall, when it was constructed, was known as an anti-fascist protective rampart by the East German authorities. Perhaps the situation of the Vietnamese boat people is the most poignant example. After all, Vietnam has suffered the scourge of war for decades, if not centuries. One war or another, one type of aggression or another. And even the Vietnam War in which we were involved, in which the United States was involved, brought a tremendous amount of destruction and suffering to the population, but the people did not leave their country. They did not abandon their native soil until the nation fell to communism. Then they began to leave, even if it meant just venturing out in fragile boats with no guarantees of safety or security, even when they would reach the free world or a free world shipping vessel. Of course, there's been a romantic idea, unfortunately, that somehow in the Western Hemisphere, for example, Fidel Castro's brand of communism was somehow different, progressive, and something good for the people. Now, of course, report after report is filtering out of Cuba about what communism under Fidel Castro really is, and it's classic Stalinistic communism. This is Armando Valladares' text, Prisoner of Castro, which was published in France in 1979. This is a Spanish version. I've yet to see the English version, actually. It's a book of poetry that was composed during his 22 years in Castro's prison because he opposed the Castro regime. Where do we find the alienation of man from man? Well, perhaps we find it everywhere, but we find a most intense, devastating type of alienation where the communist program is actually being practiced. 66 years of experiment. Has communism worked? Well, Marx felt that the workers in Paris were unfortunate when he was in Paris in 1844. But I'm sure that any one of the workers in the Soviet Union would trade places today with those workers that Marx met in the cafes of Paris. The situation in the Soviet Union can perhaps be symbolized by a black limousine, probably belonging to one of the Soviet elite, cruising by a poster of Marx and Engels. In fact, communism is a tragic social failure. Why is that? Is it simply a question of the mismanagement by a few leaders? Is it the failure of effective leadership? Is it perhaps misinterpretation of Marxist theory? We have to answer no to those questions. After all, whether we look at the regimes established by Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung, Pol Pot in Cambodia, or Heng Samrin, who displaced him, Fidel Castro, or the Ortegas in Nicaragua, wherever we look, when we see that Marxism-Leninism gains control and is put into practice, we find the same type of practice. The problem is not coming from these sorts of factors, but the problem is stemming out of the theory of Marxism itself. So we'll spend the remaining moments of this particular presentation discussing the four fundamental errors of Marxist theory. The first error is the most basic. It involves a misconception of what the universe is all about, what the universe is actually composed of. According to Marx, matter is the essence of the universe. The universe is essentially composed of matter, and it has always existed. Of course, stemming out of this is the denial of God. There's no God. Even more than this, there's a denial of something very fundamental in science, and that is the concept that cause precedes effect. and that there's an orderly relationship between cause and effect, that you can't have an effect without a cause. This is the basis of the ontological argument for the existence of God. It's also the fundamental underlying principle for all of science, that something that's achieved in one laboratory today can be reproduced in another laboratory tomorrow. But the concept that the universe is uncaused is a challenge to that fundamental relationship of cause and effect. Furthermore, the denial of God means the denial of absolute values. There are only relative values in the Marxist world, values which must be established by human beings in order to pursue their particular ends. But we challenge this view that matter is the essence of the universe. First of all, we affirm that fundamentally the existence of God is a question of faith. Marxism seems to take the position that science destroys religion, that science is the enemy of religion and will ultimately dispose of religion and belief in God altogether. However, even science cannot intrude into the domain of faith. And this is where the important question of God's existence ultimately resides. Marx himself cannot intrude into that domain because it is a question of faith. Furthermore, there is considerable logical, scientific, and experiential evidence that God does exist. And we're going to talk more about that when we expound on the CAUSA worldview. However, for now, let's just summarize some of that evidence. There are the arguments of reason, the so-called proofs of God, which people have dealt with for centuries. People have been diving into and exploring the various logical statements and proofs that can be made about God. This is simply a list or a grouping, a classification of some of those proofs, beginning with the ontological proof of St. Anselm, and going on through the cosmological, teleological, moral proof, experiential proof, inductive proof based on confirmation theory. I'm not going to spend the time to get into all these. Some people do. They're fascinated by it. In fact, maybe you've seen this book, Does God Exist?, by the German theologian Hans Küng. Actually, this was a bestseller in Germany. I don't know how it did in the United States. But here's a book that is 840 pages long, examining all these different arguments and proofs and whether or not God exists and so forth. Well, you don't have to read the book, actually. Don't rush out and buy it. All you have to do is look at the last page and find out what conclusion Mr. Küng ultimately came to. So we'll sneak ahead, and we find that Hans Küng comes up with this. The question, does God exist, can now be answered by a clear, convinced yes, justifiable at the bar of critical reason. Good. No need to wade through 840 pages of argument. The point is this: what Marx would like to dismiss with a wave of his hand is actually a considerable amount of careful reasoning into the question of God's existence. So much so that this particular investigator, after 840 pages, concludes that by reason alone, you can defend the existence of God. Then there's another category. That would be modern scientific evidence. We might mention particle physics, which we'll talk a little bit about later in the CAUSA worldview. Thermodynamics, genetics, quantum mechanics, molecular biology. Each one of these fields has something to say about the existence of God. Of course, science does not prove God's existence, but science can take us forward, we might say, to the threshold of understanding about God. Let's take one example. When Marx looked at the world, he saw only matter. However, we observe in the universe the progressive development of organisms from lower to higher states of complexity, differentiation, and organization, finally arriving at human beings. This process, this developmental trend, can generally be called the process of evolution, or the process of development. But if we try to explain this process from a strictly materialistic viewpoint, in other words, if we are just associated with, if we're just familiar with the chemistry and physics of the laboratory, and we look at something like this, we would definitely come to the conclusion that this should never occur. The laws of thermodynamics, which discuss entropy, say that you can never get into a higher state of organization unless you put some input in. In other words, they suggest, although not in the form of a rigorous scientific proof, but there's a very strong suggestion that order, organization, energy is being added while this process is taking place. That a real look at evolutionary thought from the point of view of the laws of chemistry and physics strongly suggests to us that a creator is indeed working to create life. Again, I don't proclaim this as a rigorous scientific proof, since I've already said that that's impossible. But I would say, again, it takes us to the threshold of really a proof of God. Even some of you who've heard the lectures before, heard the CAUSA seminar before, you notice that there's always a slight rearrangement or some new slides. I couldn't help but think, as I was working on the slides for this seminar, really I can testify that even just to modify the slides a little bit and try to make it a little bit better requires an investment of energy. The arrangement will never just become better by itself. It involves getting suggestions, doing more research, just even to make the lecture flow a little bit smoother. Then we come to the, basically we could say, preposterous position that something like a human being could come as a product of chance. Actually, science tends to argue against it, contrary to what Marxism suggests. However, reason, science can teach us something, but ultimately we depend upon our personal experience, our personal feeling, intuitive feeling, as to where the human being comes from. Where does this complex being, which is us, which we can study on a physical level, and we can study even the psyche of the human being. And ultimately we end up with a very strong feeling that this is coming from somewhere. And this has led the great religionists and the great spiritualists to believe that the human being is a creation of God. Finally, to return to Marxist materialism, Marxist materialism is a type of hoax. Now, before I used such a strong word, I decided to check the dictionary definition of hoax. After all, I didn't want to say it if I couldn't back it up. So Webster's dictionary defines hoax as to trick into believing or accepting as genuine something false and often preposterous. When I see that definition, I just feel very sure that Marxist materialism is a hoax. Marx is claiming that science is with him. He's also claiming that he knows something that is really unknowable. And those who follow down that path find themselves believing something that is ultimately preposterous. However, I'll leave it at that. The CAUSA worldview with regard to this question is based on the affirmation that there is a first cause, God. And that God created according to a purpose and a plan. That he created according to laws and principles. And that if we don't take into account those laws and principles and that overriding purpose, then our various programs and plans are going to come to frustration. Furthermore, the existence of God means the possibility of absolute values. And we'll talk more about a basic theme of this conference, and that is the elevation of the human perspective to a good, clear perspective of what is valuable and what is not, an absolute value perspective. In any case, let's move on. The second error stems out of the first. Because of his misunderstanding of the origin and nature of the universe, Marx was led to conclude that a human being is nothing but an economic animal. That the human essence is material, and that the human nature is an accidental product of evolution. We recall that the Marxist view of man, as it was elaborated by Engels and approved by Marx, or at least Marx had no objection to it, is based on Lamarckism, the concept of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. In other words, the species, the nature of the species results from the external conditions around it. So the human nature results from the external conditions. In order to change the human nature, simply change the external conditions. This was the thinking of Pol Pot. When the very day, April 17th, 1975, when Phnom Penh fell, he began an evacuation of millions of people. He wanted to change their external conditions and to recreate them as new communist people. And he ended up killing perhaps 50% of the people in the country. Some estimates are that high. Needless to say, this view of a human being really offers no basis for human rights. No fundamental philosophical basis. Even though, according to the rules of Leninism, a Marxist can take whatever sort of position is advantageous at the moment. So many times Marxist-Leninists will be the champions of human rights. But there's, in this view of man as an economic animal, where's the foundation? Where's the support for a view of human rights? Where do rights come from? When Leninism is practiced, rights are simply bestowed upon the individual by the state, if he cooperates with the state program. This view of a human being led to Marx's false view of human alienation. He views man as an economic animal. Therefore, alienation is an economic phenomenon. This is the materialistic view. And the materialistic solution is legal and political. Actually, it involves the overthrow of the existing economic relations and the key negation of private property relations. The external diagnosis produces an external treatment which really doesn't get down to the real core of the problem. In fact, if we look at the theories of evolution, we must take into account that Lamarckism, the basis for the Marxist view of man, has fallen into disrepute. In fact, this idea that the organism interacts with the environment and changes and passes that on to offspring, the transmission of acquired characteristics, has been completely discredited by modern science. We might go so far as to say proven false. Some of you are probably familiar with the Soviet geneticist Lysenko, who based all kinds of extraordinary claims on Lamarckism. He said that he had developed new hybrid forms of wheat using Lamarckian principles. And anyone who opposed him was punished in the true Soviet style. However, Lysenko ultimately became exposed as his theories are completely devoid of fact, and he fell into disrepute. It's a very interesting segment of the history of Soviet science. And of course, Lamarck and Lysenko went down together. Today, the scientific world is very interested in the theories of Darwin. And the view of Darwin is that change occurs, first of all, in the reproductive mechanism. In other words, it's not the environmental pressure which causes the change. It has to do with the genetic code. Darwin wasn't familiar with the genetic code. Today we understand about the genetic code. Then there is the process of natural selection. However, even Darwinism is still being evaluated. It may be in vogue at the present time, but there are certainly dissenting views against Darwinism. Two-time Nobel Prize winner Dr. Svend Georgi compares the idea of Darwinistic evolution to the idea that I could drop my watch on the floor and that if a few parts became bent somehow randomly, I might end up with a better watch. He says it's preposterous that you would have to design a new watch and you'd have to create the entire watch at once because the parts are interrelated to one another. You cannot just change one part or another part. You have to change the entire mechanism. So there's a two-time Nobel Prize winner, and of course his prizes were in the field of biology, challenging very much the Darwinistic view. There's the possibility today of a tremendous breakthrough in evolutionary science. In fact, it's interesting to compare evolutionary science today to the science of physics at the turn of the century. Physics, before Einstein, was thought to be a dead science. Not dead, but a complete science. In fact, the great British physicist Rutherford was trying to decide which branch of science to go into, and he was advised, stay away from physics, there's nothing left to discover. And that was at the beginning of the 20th century. However, it turned out there were a few things still left to discover. And when those things were investigated, the whole realm of the new physics or modern physics opened up. And we'll have some more to say about that later in the conference. However, simply by comparison, Darwinism looks like it has things locked up. But there are still even some areas which continue to be investigated. Perhaps we'll see a revolution in evolutionary science the same way we saw a revolution in physics. In any case, Lamarckism, which is the basis of the Marxist view, has been discredited by scientific investigation. The CAUSA worldview then begins by affirming that human beings are created by God, and that this original human nature, or so-called human species essence, comes from God. This is in accordance with the religious tradition, that God created the human beings in His image and likeness. This provides a basis, a philosophical basis for human rights, that they are given by God, that they are, as the documents of which the Founding Fathers produced, that they are inalienable rights given by God. Furthermore, human nature is, we might say, spiritual and physical. And it is not the case that the spirit is simply a product of the physical. That in fact, human beings have this internal dimension and external dimension. And that some of the things which are most important to us are the internal qualities, the striving after truth, goodness, ultimately the need for love, the striving after love, which becomes perhaps the most important fundamental human need. Perhaps every mother knows this, that what the baby requires most are not just the external necessities of food and so forth, but that even that child cannot develop properly if the child does not receive love. This is not to deny the importance of the external aspect, but the irony is that Marxism, which focuses completely on the external, produces a system which cannot satisfy either dimension. So we would hope that by understanding that the internal is most important, we can come up with a system that can provide for both. Finally, although it's cut off at the bottom, there's an implication as regards alienation. That alienation is not, as Marx said, simply an economic phenomenon, but rather, as the religious tradition affirms, the fundamental problem of alienation has to do with a disruption of the relationship between man and God. In other words, that the relationship between man and God has been disturbed. Whether we call this the original sin, the fall of man, there are many, many words. But the religious view affirms that this is the cause. This is the root cause of alienation, and then it has its manifestations in all the walks of human life. This view supports all forms of religious seeking for God. Of course, each religion has its own doctrine of salvation. Even the various denominations of Christianity have different doctrines of salvation. But all in common try to understand the nature of the Creator and try to reconcile man with God. Then, the third error of Marxism. According to Marx, simply put, conflict brings progress. Dialectical materialism pits one element against another. And Marxism will always advocate confrontation, the exacerbation of disagreements. It will always foment a face-off, a showdown, and a violent resolution. However, dialectical materialism is a tremendous distortion of reality. The dialectic was taken from Hegel. Hegel had developed an idea regarding the progress of thought. That if you and I simply agree, we don't progress in our thinking. That there has to be some kind of challenge and critique and disagreement, and then we go on to greater levels of thought. But Marx took this dialectic out of the realm of ideas and force-fit it into his materialistic framework. But it produces absurdities, such as this example taken from the Marxist philosophy textbook of the Soviet Union. It reads, an atom, for example, could not exist without the interaction, the struggle of the positively charged nucleus and the negatively charged electrons. Struggle between protons and electrons. But this is a tremendous distortion of reality. And it's designed to justify violent action in order to carry society forward. In reality, we find that violent process is not necessary for progress. In fact, Engels, who wrote the texts Anti-Düring and Dialectic of Nature, he pretended to see the dialectic everywhere, all around in the universe. But if we look at the relationship, for example, between proton and electron, is it really a struggling, conflictive relationship that produces the atom? Is it a struggle and conflict between stamen and pistil that produces the seed? In fact, it's not. First of all, there's a common purpose. And this is the key point. If two things have an overlapping or common purpose, then the relationship that they enter into is not a conflicting relationship. It is a relationship of giving and receiving. So we can talk about subject and object elements. The word subject and object here should not be misunderstood. It simply means one initiates and the other responds. So unless there's cooperation, unless there's initiation and response based upon a common purpose, there's never any progress. Now, we're not saying that the proton has a certain purpose in mind, but obviously the purpose of the creator is being fulfilled through the relationship between proton and electron, through stamen and pistil. It's only when we get to the human level that we find that the various parties can have their own purposes. So human beings can actually conceive of purposes. And when those purposes bring us together in a cooperative way, there's progress. For example, the CAUSA seminar. There could not be a CAUSA seminar if everyone here, inclusive, did not feel that they were going to gain something. I'd venture to say that no one would be in the room unless they felt they could benefit from it. This is the nature of cooperation, cooperative effort. When there is contradictory purpose, then there's a tendency to repel, and no relationship is made. But progress does not come that way. Marx, as we'll talk about later this afternoon, his emphasis on conflict is basically missing the boat. He's describing a secondary process. Really, our view is existence, progress, and development can only occur through purposeful, harmonious interaction. Finally, the fourth error, according to Marx, history is a series of class struggles which will culminate in communism. Marx said that all the significant events of history involve class struggles, and the final class struggle would be between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, that this would produce socialism, and that socialism would be such a wonderful method of social organization, and it would produce so much wealth that eventually distribution would only be made on the basis of need, and socialism would turn into communism, and communism would come about. However, we have several comments about this point of view, which we'll elaborate on later. The class struggle is not the major factor in historical development. Of course there have been class struggles, but there have been many other types of struggle as well. And many times those have been key and important struggles in history. Furthermore, Marxism adopts a Hegelian point of view that history is already determined, is already lined up at what's going to happen, and that human beings really don't have free will or free choice in the matter. But what we find is that human beings have free will, and along with that free will, they have responsibility. If that responsibility is not fulfilled, history doesn't move, doesn't progress. Now, in fact, in Marxism, we find a serious ambiguity about this subject. There are a number of serious ambiguities in Marxism, but one of the most interesting regards free will. On the one hand, human beings have no choice in the matter. There's these economic, material laws are just operating, and history is going forward, and no one has any choice. But then on the other hand, we find that Marxism is like a call to action. It's actually a religion. It actually tries to inspire its followers to act. So it appears on one hand as if there's no free will. It appears on the other hand as if each person is challenged to freely choose to take communism forward. It's a very serious philosophical ambiguity which is not resolved in the writings of Marx or Marxists. Finally, we say that history is not moving toward communist utopia. This is not just an opinion, but we can make a certain linguistic analysis here and show that this is a fact. What does communism mean? What do we mean when we use the word communism? Generally, we use it as a synonym for Marxism-Leninism. In that sense, communism as a program, Marxism-Leninism, is a social failure. It does not bring forth a utopia. But there's another sense of the word communism, because communism also represents an ideal, the so-called workers' paradise. Strictly speaking, according to Soviet ideology, the Soviet Union has not reached communism yet. It's still in the socialism stage. It's still moving towards communism. But then what is communism as an ideal? It is a myth. In fact, it's an irrational myth. It cannot be supported by reason, by reasonable arguments. Marx, of course, he took the position of a great opponent of mythologies. and a great advocate of reason. And yet his communism, we find at its very bottom, is not supported by reason and has to fall into the category of religious faith or myth, to use his sort of word. The real cause of conflict in this worldview stems out of an internal struggle that is going on within human beings. And this is the struggle that the great philosophers and religionists have talked about. The struggle between virtue and vice, or between good and evil, or between, ultimately, selfishness and unselfishness. Now this becomes a key word in our view, because by selfishness we do not mean the desire to improve oneself. That is a part of human nature. What we mean by selfishness can best be understood, or can perhaps be understood through this definition. Lack of a proper value perspective, a narrow, limited view of what will bring benefit to a person. If we consider it this way, we find that selfishness is at the root of all the various manifestations of social evil. A narrow, rigid view of self-benefit is responsible for racism, for corruption, for abuse of the environment, for sacrificing the next generation's environment for this generation's gain, for exploitation itself. Actually, Marxism raises a tremendous rallying cry against exploitation. But exploitation is only one manifestation of a fundamental problem of selfishness, confusion in values. And Marxism doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the philosophical content to resolve the problem of selfishness. Therefore, we find tremendous exploitation applied under Marxist governments. The CAUSA worldview then offers and develops a different view of history, based on the existence of God, and based on the belief that God created with a purpose, that God will not abandon or change that purpose, but that God will rather guide history towards the fulfillment of that purpose. Nevertheless, man is created as a free actor in history, able to make choices. God does not operate in a coercive way. God seeks to inspire, and that this is the true function of religion, to inspire human beings, and that in no case will God coerce or force human beings. Therefore, the human being has a tremendous responsibility in history. History is not completely determined, as Marxism suggests, but more as Toynbee would have envisioned it, that man finds himself in challenging situations, and that is the human response to those challenges which determines whether history goes forward or not. This constitutes a very quick, brief, and general overview of Marxist ideology, how it has resulted in the tremendous social failure which is communism today, and how that social failure is not just a product of accident or misapplication, but that the Marxist theory and ideology itself is doomed to social failure when it's applied.
Thank you, Bill. I think that you will agree that we now have somewhat of a panoramic view of Marxism. We understand something of Marxist theory and something of its fallacies. In the following 3 presentations, we will deal with these matters in greater detail. I believe that after these 3 presentations, you will know more about communist theory than most communists do. Please join us. The lecture which you are about to view is entitled Dialectical and Historical Materialism. This presentation is significant because it challenges the so-called scientific bases of Marxism, as well as Marx's view of history. A number of experts in Marxism have particularly applauded the quality of this lecture by Mr. William Ley. Please enjoy it.
Well, we're moving ahead at breakneck speed and covering a lot of ground and trying to move through the overview of Marxism. At this point, we're going to spend the final two sessions of the afternoon going back into some of the areas that we have briefly mentioned and looking at them in a little more detail because of their importance. As I say, different components of Marxist ideology can be taught selectively wherever it's judged that they will be most effective. For example, the surplus value theory, part of the economic theories, which we're going to talk about later, was right after the Sandinistas consolidated control in Nicaragua. There was an intensive effort to teach people surplus value theory in Nicaragua. This is part of the process of conscientization. Well, I can't even say it right in English, and you should hear when I try it in Spanish. In other words, making people aware that they're being exploited. So we're going to show those kinds of arguments later. And in this session, we're going to be talking about dialectical and historical materialism. So can we have the house lights down, please? Dialectical materialism is the basic metaphysics of Marxism. Of course, Marx critiqued the concept of metaphysics and never considered himself a metaphysician, but he had his own metaphysics, and it has since become known as dialectical materialism, the basic philosophical approach taken by Marx and the Marxists. And the application of that metaphysics to history is historical materialism. Now, materialism is a trend or a current in philosophical thought which has its origins right along in antiquity, right along with the origins of philosophy itself. And it's based on some kind of view that the universe is composed of matter, which in turn is based on some kind of intuitive grasp of what matter is, that matter is the stuff of which everything is composed. Obviously, materialism did not begin with Karl Marx. And yet the Marxist materialism is distinctive. It has distinctive features, and we want to bring them out in this presentation. Around the time of Marx, we see that the predominant sort of materialism that was prevalent and important was mechanistic materialism. This was materialism influenced by the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. The mechanics of Isaac Newton allowed scientists and in turn philosophers to view the universe as a type of great machine with many, many component parts. So if those parts could be examined and understood, and if the laws which govern the behavior of those parts could be understood, then one could understand the entire machine. And one could even predict future states of the machine. So this was the mechanistic view, mechanistic materialism. However, Marx critiqued mechanistic materialism. He said ultimately it lapsed back into idealism. In other words, it was vulnerable to the idea of God. If the universe was a machine, who created the machine? It appears there had to be a creator. And also, who put that machine into motion? Who gave that first impulse? It led back to the arguments of Aristotle, and later used by Thomas Aquinas, that God is that prime mover, the one who gave the first impulse or motion to the universe. So for Marx, mechanistic materialism was unsatisfactory because it wasn't a rigorous, perfect type of materialism. We mentioned also the importance of Feuerbach's views, particularly his attacks on religion and his view that human beings had created God. However, Marx went on to critique Feuerbach and said that, after all, he was half an idealist. He ultimately lapsed back into idealism. He was calling for a solution on the level of idealism. Instead of digging down into the economic material reality, He simply wanted a reform of religion. He wanted to get God out of religion. But for Marx, that was an inconsistent, idealistic approach. So in his theses on Feuerbach, Marx broke from Feuerbach. And he wrote, as we have said, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And this particular statement gives us an insight into Marx. Because for Marx, the quest for truth, or the interpretation of the world, is very much secondary. And what's really important is to carry out the revolutionary program. Dialectical materialism, then, is not so much an inquiry into the nature of things as it is a justification for a particular program that Marx felt would change the world. Now, in order to understand why Marx's brand of materialism is different from others, let's consider what are the basics of the materialistic position. As we've said, that the universe is essentially matter, that the universe has always existed. In other words, God did not create the universe. But there is a problem with this view. There is a paradox. There is a complication here. And it has to do with something that we've already mentioned when we talked about evolution. And that is, how does the simple become the complex without God as the creator? If we hold God as the creator, this is no problem. But without God, how do simple things in themselves become more complex things and more complex things? And Marx felt that he had the answer in the dialectic. The dialectic, taken from Hegel, who used it, the concept of thesis and antithesis, relating with one another in a contradictory way and producing a step forward in the form of a synthesis. Hegel used it to explain the advance of human thinking in his work, The Phenomenology of Mind. How the mind, how the idea, how thought develops dialectically. But Marx took it into his materialistic framework and used it to create a new type of materialism, dialectical materialism. What he felt was a rigorous materialism that would never fall back to the idea of God, would never require recourse to the idea of a prime mover or a first cause or an origin or a creator. Now, Marx didn't bother to expound his metaphysics. He left it up to Engels, who in his text, Anti-Düring and Dialectic in Nature, explained precisely what are the three laws of Marxism. So these laws, according to Engels, are, one, the interpenetration of opposites. This is said to be the most important law in the Marxist dialectic, that everything is composed of two elements struggling, two elements in contradiction. This becomes an argument for social practice. These three laws are not just metaphysical laws, because for Marx, philosophers have always interpreted the world. The point is to change it. So each idea has a practical application, and ultimately the interpenetration of opposites becomes the basis for the doctrine of class struggle. That within a society are two classes struggling, and inherently contradictory interests keep them struggling. The second law is the law of transformation of quantity into quality. Now this is a little bit complicated, but it says that every change or every process is first of all a change in the quantity of something, and that this reaches a point where it becomes transformed. The change in quantity becomes transformed, and something that is qualitatively different emerges. It may sound abstract or complicated, but ultimately it becomes the justification for revolution. In fact, Stalin emphasized that the transformation is an abrupt transformation, a violent transformation, that quantities may change, but finally this limiting point is reached where a violent, abrupt transformation of quality is necessary. So this law supports the argument that revolution is required. And finally, Engels talks about the negation of the negation. And I know if you're not familiar with this, you have to really bear with this kind of terminology. The idea is that everything starts out as an affirmation, which is negated. Then the negation is negated again so that you recover the affirmation, and generally speaking, on some sort of higher level of development. You get your affirmation back again, but it has passed through one cycle, therefore it represents a step further along in the process of development. This law is ultimately used to support the idea that history is moving towards communism, and that throughout the succession of class struggles, the final negation will bring us to the ideal communist society. We'll see in a few moments how that argument is constructed. Now, if we want to see these laws in operation, if we want to see an example of these laws, we might select something in the universe that would seem to be appropriate. And in fact, we select something that has been used in the Marxist literature to justify and illustrate the laws of the dialectic. And our example is the example of the egg. According to one text by the Revolutionary Communist Party, they say an egg is called the science of revolution. An egg, while containing a developing chicken, remains an egg, a hard white shell surrounding an embryo. So, the egg consists of this hard shell surrounding the embryo. In this case, the shell would be the larger whole, the thesis or affirmation. And within that larger whole is contained its own contradiction. There's this secondary element or antithesis or negation which exists within the larger whole but is fundamentally contradictory to the larger whole. However, how does that contradiction intensify so that it finally comes to the point of destruction of one or the other party? Well, that's through quantitative change transforming to qualitative change. In other words, the embryo gets bigger. The embryo changes in quantity, becomes bigger, until it reaches this limiting point, this critical point. And at this critical point, the quantity transforms into quality, and the eggshell is broken apart, and something qualitatively different, the chick, emerges. And of course, the shell is destroyed so that the chick can be born. In addition, the whole life cycle of the chicken may be taken as an illustration of the negation of the negation. So the chicken in this case is the affirmation, and the chicken is negated to give the egg, and the egg is negated again to give the chicken, and so on and so on. And each time you get, presumably, some sort of more evolved or developed chicken, because you're passing through one cycle of the negation of the negation. Well, it may seem like a sort of a kind of frivolous or like a child's exercise, but it's this very argument, it's this very type of analysis which Marxism applies to society. So to read from that same text, an egg, while containing a developing chicken, remains an egg, a hard white shell surrounding an embryo. Capitalist society, while containing elements of future socialist society which continually struggle within and against the dominant capitalist framework, is still nevertheless capitalist society. In other words, capitalist society, according to this Marxist text, is just like the egg. It contains the larger whole, which in Marxist terms is the production relations, or in other words, the capitalist society. But within that larger whole is this element, this component, which is fundamentally contradictory to the capitalist society itself. And that is the working class. The working class, the workers per se, are part of what Marx called the productive forces. The productive forces are the tools and technology and the workers themselves which allow production to take place. Now, what is the motor, the engine, the motive force behind all kinds of social and historical development and change? Well, in Marxism, there's a certain given. And that given is, that initial assumption, premise, is that the productive forces continuously develop. It is not adequately explained why they develop, what sort of dialectic is operating to make them develop. It's simply held that they do develop, they continually develop, and that's basically the engine that is causing all historical development. Now, how does that engine how is it transmitted, how is it translated into all kinds of historical phenomena? Well, it's through the laws of economic movement. For example, the centralization of capital. The capitalists control the means of production, but they compete with one another, and eventually they put one another out of business. So the capital becomes centralized in the hands of fewer and fewer capitalists. Therefore, capitalists get squeezed out and they join the working class, Therefore, the working class becomes bigger, quantitatively larger. Furthermore, as the productive forces, the tools and the machinery are developing, there's more and more automation. There's more and more introduction of machinery, and this, according to Marx, puts workers out of work. So there are more and more unemployed. The unemployed are miserable. Therefore, the misery of the working class increases. Not just the number of workers, but let's say their misery, their suffering increases. Finally, Marx predicted that wages would go down. Some people are surprised to hear this. But Marx definitely predicted that wages would go down. In fact, when wages went up, while he was revising Das Kapital, he just ignored those statistics. His prediction required that wages would go down and that eventually they would reach the subsistence level. Workers would only receive what was necessary for them to survive. So because of these laws of economic movement, the size and the misery and the poverty of the working class increases until the contradiction between working class and capitalist society becomes acute. There are more workers, there is more unemployment, there's more poverty, and the workers are transformed into something called the revolutionary proletariat. Something qualitatively new is coming out, and that is the new breed of human being, the revolutionary proletariat. Then the capitalist structure is going to be broken apart, and the new qualitative form is going to emerge, which is socialism. Finally, the capitalist shell will be completely destroyed. This is the Marxist view of how social development occurs. It has actually captured the minds and imaginations of a lot of people. And yet, we have to go back and we have to look at those principles of dialectical materialism and see if they are really sound. See if those laws are really meaningful. See if those are really universal laws. Let's look at this process of development according to the Marxist view. We've said that everything is composed of contradictory elements in contradiction with one another. That the essence of relationship, according to Marxism, is contradiction. Furthermore, this relationship can be called a subject-subject relationship. One party desires to be subject, so does the other one. They don't cooperate. It isn't that one initiates and the other responds. They try to dominate one another, and ultimately, one of them will destroy the other one. That's how progress occurs, when one party destroys the other part. That's progress, according to this view. However, is that what is really happening? And we've already introduced the idea that this is not what is happening. That actually, progress occurs when there is common purpose. And it occurs through the harmonious interaction of subject and object parts. What Marx was referring to, what he got locked into, and what he felt was the fundamental primary relationship of the universe, is actually something secondary called repulsion, the subject-subject interaction. When two subjects approach one another, for example, let's say two protons, if we talk about it in a physics level, two protons approach one another, they repel one another. There's a force of repulsion. The subject and subject will not be able to form a constructive relationship. However, this is a secondary phenomenon. There's no progress involved in this. There's no development that comes out of this. They have to be repelled, and eventually they have to, in order to make progress, the protons, we could say, have to find electrons. It's only through this subject-object interaction that progress occurs. Marxism is based upon the idea that this secondary phenomenon of repulsion is going to bring progress, but that's incorrect. Only with common purpose and mutual interaction and initiation-response, or subject-object relationships, can mutual benefit or a new being come about. Even the egg is an example of this. That is to say, the egg is an example of subject-object relationship. There's one common purpose, although it's not necessarily conceived in the mind of the embryo, but from the point of view of the creator, the purpose is the development of the chick. Subject and object interact harmoniously to progress on into the development of the chick. Now let's look at the second law, which ultimately becomes a justification for revolution and violence. The idea that Every change starts out as a change in quantity, some sort of smooth or gradual change, but transforms itself into some kind of abrupt change in quality. What we find in reality is that, first of all, changes can be gradual. There are certain changes, such as the change from night to day. All right, you might say that it involves some quantitative change in the Earth's position, and that becomes qualitative, but there's no abrupt transformation. The changing of the seasons would be another example. Furthermore, we find that quantity and quality can change simultaneously. Even within the egg, it's not the case that the quantity of the embryo changes, and then suddenly, when the egg breaks apart, that big embryo inside turns into a chick. Actually, that's not realistic at all. We know that during the incubation period, there are a whole series of complex biochemical and physiological interactions going on that transform that embryo into a chick, so that when the 21-day incubation period is over, the chick is actually already there, already ready to emerge as a chick. Another example that one person in our staff came up with is this interesting case of the sea urchin egg. It says in the middle here, in 2 hours, 40 minutes after fertilization, the sea urchin egg divides 7 times. The embryo now has 128 cells, but has grown only in complexity, not in size. It seems completely contradictory. Here it was only a change in quality, if you will, and no change in quantity. However, one philosopher friend of ours discredits the idea of quantity and quality in this way. He says, supposedly only the quantity is changing. But quantity of what? It's quantity of quality. I think I'll just let that one hang in the air and pass on. Finally, we come to this idea of the negation of the negation. Well, I've been throwing around this word negation, but it's quite legitimate to ask, what does negation mean? It seems to mean the destruction of something. You know, it sounds like if you negate something, you're going to destroy it. But perhaps it means cyclical transformations without destruction. Indeed, what we find is that in Marxist literature, in the writings of Marx and Engels, there are 2 completely different meanings, which are used interchangeably and which are never clearly separated. When Marx talks about the negation of private property, he means the destruction of private ownership of property. However, when Engels comes along a few years later and writes Dialectics in Nature and Anti-Dühring in order to support this view, he makes light of the idea that negation is the destruction. He says, no, negation is a type of transformation unique to that particular individual being. And he gives all kinds of examples about cyclical transformations without destruction. It's what's called a sophism, the maneuvering of terms and maneuvering of ideas in order to construct an argument which at the very bottom is either false or meaningless. In fact, if we were to critique the Marxist laws of the dialectic, perhaps instead of saying that they're false, we might better say, first of all, that they're not universal laws, that they sometimes hold true, depending on how we interpret them, but they don't necessarily always hold true. But perhaps an even better critique would be this. At the bottom, they don't really have any clear meaning. They're meaningless. It's really very undetermined what they mean. They are used, however, this does not mean that they are not useful. They may be meaningless. They may not be universal, but they have a very important function in Marxism today. They are used to confuse issues. They are used to sidetrack arguments. Ultimately, they are used to justify repressive and undemocratic measures and expansionism. Furthermore, notions of dialectical action are used to explain the persistent refusal of history to conform to the Marxist scheme of things. Dialectical materialism will not help us to understand reality, but it's very important in terms of the advancement of the Marxist program, particularly as it has been used in an interpretation of history. In other words, when we expand this analysis of society to all of history, we come up with historical materialism, the materialist view of history. Before we describe the progression of history according to the materialist view, it's important to understand the Marxist view of the construction of society, the composition of society. According to the Marxist view, there's a superstructure and there's a base. The base is the foundation. The base is what is fundamental. The base determines the superstructure. The base is the economic system, the economic relationships between individuals. The most fundamentally important thing in Marxism is one's economic identity. One is either a capitalist or one is a worker. One is either a feudal lord or one is a serf. This is fundamental identity. Then on the basis of this economic system, then the superstructure is constructed. The superstructure is everything else. Politics, religion, morality, philosophy. In the Marxist view, these are secondary. These just sort of grow out of the base, and they are determined by the nature of the economic relationships. This is the economic view of history. What does it actually mean? How do Marxists view history? We mentioned already the origin of the human being, that originally there was a sort of a ape-like predecessor, and that through the use of tools and through labor, language developed, reason developed, and the ape was transformed into the human being. So the first kind of society that historical materialism recognizes is the primitive communal society. This is an idyllic sort of world. There are no private possessions. There is no private property. There is no division of labor. Everyone just shares everything and does everything. However, as the tools, as the productive forces, remember, are progressing, then gradually there's division of labor and there's private ownership of property. First of all, people start to own their tools. And then it's only a small step in Marxist view before they start to own each other. Therefore, slave society, the first class society, comes into existence. In the slave society, there are the slave owners and the slaves, two antagonistic classes. Interesting thing, with the birth of class society, we find the birth of the state. The state is something set up by the haves in order to dominate the have-nots. That's the purpose of the state in Marxism. Furthermore, Marx says that religion has its origins in primitive man's attempts to explain natural phenomena. I'm sure you're familiar with this argument. In other words, the lightning strikes the tree, caveman doesn't understand why that happened, so he invents God, and he says God did it. So supposedly religion has its origins in that kind of thing. However, once the class society is born, the ruling class seizes upon religion, and from this point onward uses religion and uses philosophy in order to maintain its position, in order to dominate the lower class. Still, the dialectic is operating. So eventually the slaves will overthrow the slave masters and set up a feudal society. In the feudal society, there will again be two classes, the lords and the serfs, and you'll find the lords using philosophy and using religion and using the state in order to keep their economic power. So according to Marx, someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, who we may regard as a great philosopher, he was nothing other than a sort of an employee of the feudal lords, and his scholastic philosophy was just designed to keep them in power. Even the church, Marx said, just a tool of that ruling class. In any case, even though they have all these things at their disposal, the feudal lords will not be able to stop the dialectic, so there will be a revolution, such as the French Revolution, and the new capitalist society will be established. Again, there are two classes, the capitalists and the workers. And again, they will be employing the state and religion and philosophy and other elements of the superstructure to keep their position. But they won't be able to, because the dialectic will operate, the new socialist revolution will take place, and socialist society will be established. But here we've crossed a threshold, because with the establishment of socialist society, says Marx, the means of production, the factories, the tools, the machines, will no longer be in the hands of an elite group, but rather they will be in the hands of the workers themselves. So we see the end of class society, and socialism will naturally give way to communism. Of course, Marxist theorists emphasize, the socialist stage is a stage of transition. So, for example, you're going to need a secret police, such as the KGB. Because without a secret police, you're not going to be able to remove those reactionary elements, those philosophers and religionists, and those people who will try to drag you back into capitalism. Also, you're going to need a strong military force. This is what the Sandinistas keep emphasizing to the people of Nicaragua. Because you have to protect yourself from your capitalist neighbors who may try to drag you back. In any event, with a strong police and military force, you'll be able to naturally move on into communism, the highest stage of development. Notice that what we have here is the classic negation of the negation. The classless society is negated to form the class society. Then there are a series of class societies, but finally this is negated to recover the ideal classless state of man. Not only that, but when we look here, what we really find are all the characteristics of a religious view of history, in a perverted form. It's sort of a pseudo-religious view of history. In fact, we see the fundamental elements of the Christian view of history here. The primitive communal society is the idyllic state, like the Garden of Eden, before there was any sin or any selfishness, or in the Marxist view, before there was any private property. And then we have the fall of man, which is when people began to own private property, and they began to own the means of production, and they began to own one another. Then there's a history of sin and tribulation. But ultimately there will be salvation. There will be salvation into the ideal communist society. And in order for that salvation to occur, there has to be a savior. Yes, there is a Messiah in Marxism. There has to emerge this different kind of human being, different from everybody else. And without this new human being emerging, there's no salvation. And that new savior or Messiah for Marxism is the proletariat. The revolutionary proletariat has been transformed. It's not just the workers. It is the workers who have become transformed by their oppression. They have been exploited so much that they become unselfish. They no longer want to control, dominate, and exploit. A new type of human being emerges. And without the emergence of this human being, there can be no communism. In theory. We'll return to that point in a moment. Well, historical materialism has excited a lot of people. It has inspired the dedication and sacrifice of young people, even giving their lives. And yet, historical materialism does not correspond to the historical record. After all, this is the test of a theory of history. This is the test of a model, whether it corresponds to reality. And what we find is a bad correspondence, or no correspondence, or little correspondence in the case of historical materialism. Point number one, religion is supposed to grow out of the base. Religion is part of the superstructure. When the base changes, the superstructure is supposed to change. So a new set of economic relations should give you a new set of religious principles. But what do we find? We find that religious principles are timeless. The religious truths of centuries and centuries ago are still the religious truths of today. They don't change. Actually, Marx felt that Christianity was already dead in the 19th century. But Christianity is not dead at all. The truths of Christianity are still true. Religious principles are timeless. And the idea that the religious urge is just a way of explaining natural phenomena, or that it's just a tool of the ruling class, does not get down to the fundamental roots of what religion is all about. Now, we're not saying that there haven't been abuses of religion, that there haven't been poor leaders or bad religionists throughout history. But the fundamental thrust of religion has been to elevate the human perspective, has been to reconcile man with God, and has been to comfort the heart of God by bringing his children back to him in the Christian view. So religion is something far more fundamental than the Marxist view admits or recognizes. Furthermore, there's no evidence, archaeological or anthropological, that a primitive communal society ever existed. Supposedly, according to Marx, the real genuine nature of man is not to own the means of production. However, there's no evidence for that view. It seems that people like to own things. They have a natural desire to own private property. Even animals have certain territories that they guard. And there's no evidence at all that the real true nature of man is to just own everything communally. It's just, as we've said, it's an irrational concept that Marxism affirms. Furthermore, we find no resemblance between this series of stages and any historical record, except for a certain resemblance to European history. Of course, in Europe, we know that there were slave societies, feudal societies, and ultimately what Marx called capitalist societies. But it doesn't even resemble the history of Africa, pre-Columbian South America, Asia, or various other parts of the world. So how can it be a universal law and a universal description of history? In fact, there are, even in European history, no pure examples of any one of these stages. For Marx, Rome was a slave society. However, many people feel that the slavery aspect was secondary, that the interesting thing about Rome was its democratic organization. Furthermore, Rome was not destroyed by slave revolt. Actually, slavery was almost unimportant by the time Rome was invaded by the Germanic tribes. People say it's generally felt it was destroyed by internal decay and by the invasion of the Germanic tribes, not by a slave revolt at all. Particularly, as we've pointed out, there really is no such thing as capitalism in the sense that Marx used the word. Perhaps in Marx's time, it was legitimate to talk about a certain group of people who didn't do anything except own. They didn't do anything productive, they were just owners. But today we find something very different. We find that people own and people produce. People own and they work. This worker, for example, he might work for a large company, and he may very well own stock in that company. In a sense, industry itself has become democratized. Or perhaps he's in business for himself. He owns his own means of production. So then he would have to be exploiting himself, according to Marxism, and he really doesn't fit in either category. But the most devastating critique of all is simply this, that in the pseudo-religion of Marxism, the Messiah never arrived. The proletariat never came. You cannot have communism without the emergence of the revolutionary proletariat. But where is the revolutionary proletariat? Nowhere. This is the reality that Lenin faced in 1917. In fact, he argued there was no time to wait for the proletariat, that they should go ahead and make the revolution using the intellectuals, the peasants, and the soldiers who deserted the army. There was no revolutionary proletariat. He expected that the proletariat would emerge throughout all of Europe and would overthrow the existing order of things, but that never happened. So really the Soviets are locked into a situation where for 66 years their Messiah has not come. Of course there's no true communist man emerging. Therefore there's no true communism. Therefore even the Soviet ideologues have to say that they're still in the transitional stage of socialism. All right, we might grant that they're still in the transitional stage. But the point is they're making no progress toward communism. If anything, they're going backwards and they're becoming more and more a society of state monopoly capitalism. Serious problem in terms of correspondence between theory and reality. And why is historical materialism such a bad way of viewing history? Because it's based on false assumptions. We've already covered a few of these assumptions. Marx says that economic relationships are the base of society. But are they? It's interesting to quote the humanistic philosopher Bertrand Russell. Actually, I'm sure Bertrand Russell would find a lot of objections in the CAUSA material. However, he is our ally in critiquing this point of Marxism. Russell points out, economic causes operate through men's desire for possessions and would be supreme if this desire were supreme. But in fact, is the desire for possessions the fundamental human desire? We doubt that very much. Economic relationships are one type of relationship, but not the base of society. This view of base and superstructure is contrived and misleading. Furthermore, struggle is not always between classes. Russell comments on this when he says, Marx regards economic conflicts as always conflicts between classes, whereas the majority of them have been between races or nations. In fact, Marx would have to revise this completely if he had lived into the 20th century and seen the world wars, where there was not, the workers did not unite against the capitalists, but rather they divided up by nation and fought against each other. Furthermore, violence is not always necessary to bring about change. In fact, it may not even be helpful. Now, we feel that the Revolutionary War had to be fought in this country. A lot of the various republics of the Americas feel that way. So we're not saying that violence does not sometimes accompany change, or that it isn't even sometimes necessary. However, it's not always necessary. It's not a universal law. Even the French Revolution, the same things might have been accomplished without violence, or without so much violence, and such a vengeful type of violence. Japan went from a feudal situation into a modern industrial age through the Meiji Reformation, which did not involve a revolution of the type of the French Revolution. Finally, and this list could probably be made even longer, but we just pick a few key ones. Finally, the Marxist belief that communism is the goal of history, that it will be permanent, and that it will not be destroyed dialectically, is irrational. Supposedly, the dialectic is operating, and nothing is permanent. Everything is going to be destroyed, swept away, and replaced by something new, except for communism. Well, why is communism so different? Of course, there are certain arguments that can be put forth, but none of them really hold water. Ultimately, it comes down to an irrational belief that if communism can be achieved through the dialectic will stop, in effect. And there won't be any more revolutions and changes. Perhaps just a complete stagnation, which is what the communist world seems to be like. Ultimately, historical materialism is not valid because it's based on dialectical materialism, which is not valid. And there are serious flaws and weaknesses. We might learn something from Marx. We might get some insights from Marx. But fundamentally, his theories are not helpful in terms of understanding history or in terms of developing social programs. So we have offered a different type of model. Instead of just three positions, that is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, it's very interesting that Marx excludes that top position, the position of purpose. Because ultimately, if we start to think about purpose, if we start to think in a teleological way, we are ultimately led back to the first purpose, or the original purpose, or the purpose of the Creator. So adding on the consideration of purpose is very important. And this is the model that we will use as we continue to develop our worldview. Before we conclude, however, it's useful to mention something about the human spirit. Of course, in the Marxist view, spirit comes out of material. Marxism does not deny the human spirit, but it says that the human spirit grows out of the material, or it's a function or a product of matter. So that the highest form of matter is the human brain cells, and it is these brain cells which give rise to spirit. And of course, when the body is destroyed, when the body dies, the spirit will die as well. So Marxism denies that there can be an eternal spirit because of this basic materialist view. However, it's interesting to consider the situation of a television. In other words, we'd like to make an analogy here between the mental process, mental functioning, and behavior and emotions of a human being and the way we get an image out of a television. Of course, a television is a material thing, and the image is produced in the tube, and if you destroy the tube, you destroy the image. But that doesn't mean that the tube is the source of that image. We know that the source is coming from the transmitting station, and that the television itself is just a way of energy conversion, or in other words, it's a way of expressing something that's invisible into something that's visible. We might make that same kind of analogy for the spiritual and physical aspects of the human being. Now, there's a lot that could be said on this subject. In fact, Marxist materialism rests on this view that matter is this solid stuff and that we all know intuitively what it is. But 20th century physics has swept away that old concept of matter. Now we understand that matter is energy organized into certain fields. So even the notion that matter is just this thing and that a spirit comes out of it has to be revised. Marxist materialism has to be changed. However, in particular, we're not advocating the old-fashioned idealism, but rather we're looking at a harmonized view here, that there are two aspects. There is the spiritual aspect and the physical aspect, which exist in harmony. Furthermore, that the physical is actually the expression or the externalization of the spiritual. And we will pursue this concept more as we develop the worldview more. In any event, we'll use this model to understand origin and nature of the universe, alienation, the solution to alienation, and a view of history which we feel gives us a better grasp and a deeper understanding than the Marxist determinist view. So once again, thank you for being patient and persevering through a complicated explanation of Marxist ideology.
I hope that you were inspired by this presentation. In the following presentation, Mr. William Ley will speak to us concerning Marx's economic theories. This can be viewed as the final pillar of Marxism. We look forward to you joining us. With this presentation on Marx's economic theories, we will complete our basic analysis of Marxism as it was developed by Marx and Engels. Once again, our speaker in this presentation will be Mr. Bill Ley.
We're going to begin a discussion at this point of Marxist economic theories. And as a preface to entering into this particular area, I'd like to read a little passage that comes in the, as I mentioned, a good friend of CAUSA is Dr. Fred Schwartz, who's the president of the Christian Anti-Communism Crusade, and of course we get his newsletter at our offices. Maybe a lot of you do too. And in the most recent issue, he makes a comment on communist economics. So I wanted to read this to you. He says, which of the following programs represent communist economics? 1. The distribution of land to land-hungry peasants, thereby creating a class of little capitalists. This was the economic program of the Russian communists when they seized power in 1917. Their slogan at that time was bread, peace, and land. It was also the program of the Chinese communists during their wars to conquer China and earned them the title of agrarian reformers. 2. The seizure and collectivization of the land previously given to the land-hungry peasants. This took place in 1928 in the Soviet Union and during the establishment of the communes in China. 3. The right to sell grain and other farm products privately to the highest bidder. This was the right granted to the Russian farmers by the new economic policy which Lenin introduced in 1921. 4. The right to establish and operate small businesses. This right was also granted to the Russian people in 1921 and was withdrawn in 1928. 5. Collective farming and communal living as was forced upon the Chinese people by Mao Zedong. 6. Contracts with small family units who are permitted to live privately, to farm the land allotted to them, and to dispose of the products in order to make profits, as is presently being done in China. 7. The destruction of the cities and the expulsion of the surviving population to the countryside to grow rice, as took place in Cambodia while it was under the rule of the Khmer Rouge. Of course, Dr. Schwartz's point is that none of these really represent any kind of coherent economic policy. And that's a very good point. Of course, these are all examples of applied Leninism. And applied Leninism allows you to make whatever kinds of steps or measures you need to take in order to carry the communist revolution forward. Nevertheless, what we're going to discuss in the next few minutes are communist economic theories, by which we mean Marxist economic theories, supposedly being applied or implemented in communist countries. Can we have the lights down, please? By this, we mean two general parts of Marxist theory. The labor theory of value, which of course he merely took from the classical economists before him, even though he despised them, and the theory of surplus value, which Lenin called the cornerstone of Marxist economic theory, and which Engels said was one of the great accomplishments of Karl Marx. These theories are found primarily in Das Kapital and certain other economic writings of Marx. In these writings, Marx talks about what we have called capitalism, something called capitalism. It's important to understand that sometimes it's said that there's a great confrontation in the world between communism and capitalism. Actually, capitalism is not an ideology. Capitalism is a model of how an economic system functions, created by Karl Marx. And in this model, there are two classes, the capitalists and the workers. And together, their interaction gives rise to the product. They produce various types of products. The worker contributes his labor, and the capitalist contributes his capital. But the most interesting and distinctive part of Marxist theory is that according to Marx, the capitalist really doesn't contribute anything at all. In fact, the capitalist gives absolutely nothing, contributes absolutely nothing toward the value of the product. It is only the labor of the laborer which goes into the value of the manufactured goods. So the laborer ultimately produces everything. And in return, he receives a skimpy wage, which will diminish until it's just barely enough to keep him alive. Whereas the capitalist will get the lion's share back in the form of profit, which Marx ultimately called surplus value and characterized as a crime. Now let's see how Marx went about constructing this model. Of course, no one could possibly approve of anything like this, and even just accepting this model is virtually condemning the system. So our point of view is that this doesn't really exist, but let's see how Marx came to characterize the economic system around him as capitalism, and how he came to describe capitalism as this. Let's consider, first of all, the labor theory of value, which is where Marx begins. He takes this theory, as we've said, from Ricardo and certain other classical British economists for whom he held a great contempt. He begins by describing a commodity, which he considers to be the basic unit of the economic structure. A commodity, according to Marx, is anything produced for exchange. And a commodity has two types of value, which are different from one another, which are distinct, and which are very important. The first may be called use value. Now, use value has to do with the particular function or use that the product is put to. In other words, the use value of the pen is in its ability to write. The use value of the glass is in its ability to hold liquid. So the use value of these two commodities cannot be directly compared. In fact, Marx had no use for use value. He said that it does not embody a social relation, and it's not important to the political economist. What's important is the exchange value. The exchange value is effectively the price. And Marx went on to say, and went on to question, what gives rise to exchange value? Where does exchange value come from? And how can it be measured? And how can the exchange values of different commodities be compared? So he was looking for something that was common to all commodities, that is both the source of exchange value and also gives us a way of comparing the values of different things. And he concluded that it was labor, that it was hours of labor which determine how valuable a commodity is, how much value is in the commodity. So perhaps the pen has within it 1 hour of labor time. And perhaps the glass, I meant to get a champagne glass for this, but it slipped my mind. Perhaps the glass has 2 hours of labor time. Then in this case, 2 pens would be equal to 1 glass. So in summary, value is equal to price. Marx says that value is equal to price. Marx says that price is nothing but the measure of the exchange value. Now, if value is not equal to price, well, that changes everything. In fact, the whole theory becomes meaningless. And sometimes Marx does indeed take the position that value is not equal to price. By taking that position, he reduces his theory to something very trivial. So we'll stick with the idea that in order for this theory to have any kind of meaning at all, price is the expression of exchange value, and that is equal to the number of labor hours invested in the production of the commodity. Now, even Marx was aware that there may be a variation in the number of hours necessary to produce a commodity. Maybe there's one laborer who's very industrious, and he can produce this pen in just half an hour, and maybe there's another one who requires several hours. So Marx said it was the average number of labor hours necessary within the society as a whole. That was what determined the price of the various commodities. Obviously, according to this view, value is already determined in the production process, not in the market. When things go to be bought and sold and exchanged, they already have prices associated with them. They already have these real, genuine values, which are the amount of labor that's already been put into them. Price setting is really not done in the market, in the Marxist view. Well, this theory seems to contradict common sense. For example, perhaps we go to the market and we find a watch that's worth $100 and a pile of gravel that, the watch has a price of $100 and there's a pile of gravel that has a price of $10. And yet when we investigate, it turns out that it took 5 hours to produce the watch and 5 hours to dig up the gravel. So we'd expect them to have the same value, yet they don't. In order to salvage his theory in the face of this kind of situation, Marx said that there were different types of labor hours. And he said that there is a conversion, so you can convert mathematically one type of labor hour into another. In particular, in this example, where a watch and a gravel both require 5 hours of labor time, Marx would say that the labor used to dig up the gravel was simple, unskilled labor, whereas the labor used to make the watch was complex, skilled labor. In fact, he went on to say that that complex, skilled labor involved more effort. There was more wear and tear on the nervous system, the muscles and so forth of the laborer. Therefore, it was a more intensive concentration of effort. And he said that you could come up with a factor, you could calculate a factor as to what was the conversion factor between these kinds of labor hours. So let's say, for example, that one complex skilled labor hour of watchmaking is worth 10 unskilled labor hours of digging up gravel. Now, when we multiply 5 hours of labor by this conversion factor of 10, then we come to realize that this watch actually requires 50 simple unskilled labor hours. So, no problem. The watch costs $100, the gravel costs $10. There's a reconciliation between reality and theory, and Marx said that these conversions are made in the marketplace prior to the exchange of goods. All right, you didn't laugh. That's good. Sometimes people start to laugh at this point. But I'm glad you're taking Marx seriously. Now, let's make a critique of the labor theory of value. As I said, if price and value are not equal, then the theory becomes virtually meaningless. It can either be interpreted as a definition of value, where value is redefined to mean the amount of labor put into something, or it becomes sort of a moral pronouncement. Well, the price ought to be the amount of labor. But Marx didn't really want to take either one of those courses. What he wants to say is that really price is equal to labor hours. But we note, first of all, that price is not fixed prior to exchange. Prices in the capitalist economy, or free market economy, are determined in the market. And we might make a few comments about how the market works. Of course, the market the market responds to factors such as supply and demand. That an oversupply drives the price down, whereas a scarcity brings the price up. Furthermore, if the goods are not of a good quality, in a free market situation, there will be no sale. Unless buyers are forced to buy, there will be no sale. Actually, Milton Friedman, in his text, Free to Choose, talks about 3 essential functions of prices in terms of organizing economic activity. He says that they transmit information, that they provide an incentive to adopt those methods of production that are least costly and thereby use resources for the most highly valued purposes, and they distribute income. In other words, the functioning of the market is very important. If the market is somehow blocked or somehow removed from the economic process, there's no way to transmit that information from the consumers to the producers. Furthermore, the incentive to produce things in the most efficient way is destroyed, and even the problem of distribution of income develops and becomes problematic. So in the Soviet economy, where the market is ignored and these factors are ignored, we have serious problems that result from the inability of that information to go between the consumer and the producer. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But let's consider in general, on a micro scale, in other words, an individual level, how the market works and how prices are actually set. The market is where the producer meets the consumer, and they're interested in the commodity. In particular, they're interested in the use value of the commodity. So, for example, let's say the commodity is this watch, my watch. And let's say that the producer has invested $70 in the production of this watch. And I come to the market as the consumer with $100 to spend. Now, both the producer and the consumer are interested in the use value of the watch. In other words, the actual functioning of this watch. However, they're interested in it from a different point of view. The consumer is interested in the usefulness, the ability of the watch to tell time. In this case, to tell the date, to make a little alarm when I want it to make a little alarm. All those things are very important to me. And my judgment on how useful the watch is to me can be called the efficacy of the watch. My personal subjective opinion as to how much that watch is worth to me. That can be expressed in my mind in a certain dollar amount. In this case, I may be willing to spend $100. The producer is not really interested in the watch in order to tell time. He has a watch of his own. He's interested in selling the watch and making a profit. So his view of the use value of the watch is in terms of its profitability to him. And he can also assign a numerical value to that profitability. So he spent $70. Maybe he decides to make me an offer of $85. $85. That means he can realize some profit, and I end up spending less than I thought. If we agree upon that, that's how the price is set. Because his estimation of profitability equals my estimation of efficacy, we determine a price. It really has nothing to do with the amount of hours invested in the watch. Or at best, it's only an indirect relationship. I don't really care how many hours it took him to make it. I'm not interested in that particular thing, and I frankly have no idea how many hours it took to make this watch. We've talked about these two aspects then, the aspect of profitability and the aspect of efficacy. Without them, we don't really have a commodity. In other words, something may be very useful, but if it doesn't have the aspect of profitability, it can't be a commodity. A couple of examples would be air and sunlight. They're very, very useful. They're indispensable, but there's no one in the business of buying and selling them. Now, I have to tell you that I was corrected on this point a short time ago. Someone from Sun City, Arizona, told me that in Sun City, people make money selling air and sunlight. All right, Sun City is a special case. But generally speaking, there's no profitability in something like this, so it's not really a commodity. Then also, if something has no efficacy, of course, it's hard to imagine something that would be profitable without being also efficacious. However, let's say that there's simply a product that involves a lot of labor hours invested in it, but it doesn't work. It's not going to be exchanged. It's not going to serve as a commodity. Both of these aspects are necessary so that both parties involved in the exchange have incentive. And the incentive aspect of the market is extremely important. Without this incentive aspect, the economy bogs down. And this, again, is symptomatic of the Soviet economy. In the Soviet economy, the price setting is destroyed because the prices are just assigned. They're not set in a free market situation. They're not set according to the model we just described. And ultimately, everything is assigned by quota. The incentive aspect is destroyed. This gives rise to some very curious situations. Most of the agricultural land in the Soviet Union is collectivized. However, there are small private plots that amount to less than 1% of the total agricultural land. In other words, people do have a certain amount of private enterprise in agriculture. And 1/3 of the total farm output, according to various sources, comes off of that tiny, less than 1% of the farmland. Because that is the tiny percent where the free enterprise economics are being applied. Another example comes from the Forbes magazine. It has to do with a carpet factory that the journalists visited. And it seemed to be a good carpet factory. It seemed to be producing good carpet. And it seemed like there was an opportunity to produce a lot more carpet and sell a lot more carpet because there was a scarcity of carpet. People wanted carpet. The journalists noted that there were a lot of wool overcoats hanging in the GUM department store in Red Square that nobody seemed to be interested in. So they wondered why that wool couldn't be used for carpets, something that people wanted. But they were told by the manager of the factory that that was impossible, that that factory was assigned certain quotas of wool and it would be impossible to get any more. Furthermore, the idea of raising the price of carpet, thereby generating additional capital, thereby being able to expand the operation, that was unthinkable because that would involve exploitation of the consumer. So it was impossible for that carpet factory to expand, impossible to get additional wool. Therefore, the people did without carpets while the overcoats hung in the department store. This is the destruction of this very important transmission of information that makes the free market so essential. Actually, in a Marxist economy, supposedly it is the labor amount that determines the price. But in reality, in a Marxist economy, it's just the opposite. The price determines the so-called labor amount, in quotation marks. What is labor amount in the Soviet Union? It's an arbitrary quantity of labor that's assigned to every product to justify its price. In other words, this idea of conversion in the marketplace is just a smokescreen. Supposedly the watch is worth, one complex skilled labor hour making the watch is worth 10 simple unskilled labor hours. But you can't even make that conversion until you already know the prices. Once you know the prices, it's easy to figure out this kind of conversion factor. The conversion factor comes from the prices themselves. It's not that labor amount determines price, it's that the price is back calculated to give you the labor amount. In fact, in Goldman's text, The USSR in Crisis, he talks about the price-setting function of a certain committee or a certain board in the Council of Mutual Economic Assistant Countries. He says that because they have to decide how to price the goods that they sell to one another. Because their currencies are not convertible, and because their internal pricing systems are so irrational and arbitrary, they find it simpler just to use analogous foreign trade prices charged for similar goods by private corporations to each other in the capitalist markets. They check and see what the capitalists are charging one another, and that's how they set their prices. When a Soviet planner was asked how the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance would decide prices when, as promised, the whole world became communist, he answered with a wink, "We'll keep one country capitalist just for this purpose." Furthermore, even the notion that value comes only from labor is broken apart if we consider various commodities that are not products of labor. It is for this reason that Marx had to exclude virgin land from the list of commodities. For him, land could not be a commodity. There are other things that we could imagine, such as if one was walking along and found an unusual, distinctive, unique stone. That stone would have value, even though no labor had been put into it. You might exchange it on the spot without having invested any labor in it at all. So this leads us to some more fundamental concept of where value comes from. It indicates that the Marxist concept is not fundamental enough. And what we arrive at is the idea that use value is the basis and the essence of commodity value. the use value of the watch is what both the producer and I are interested in. If the watch doesn't keep time, it can provide him no profit, and it cannot function for me as a watch. Neither one of us, in that sense, cares about the labor hours invested. It's the use value that's important. And most economists today are not really interested at all in the labor theory of value. It's sort of a relic of the past. And yet, Marxism is linked to it. It's an essential part of Marxist economic theories. Why would Marx link himself and attach himself to something that is so much at odds with common sense and experience? It was essential to fulfill the real purpose of his economic theories, and that is, as we've said, a philosophical weapon. Motivate the workers, get them out into the streets expressing their dissatisfaction, teach them that they're exploited, and convince them that all value comes from their labor, that they are being cheated. It's sometimes said that the communists go into a third world country and say, if you join the revolution, that can belong to you, and that can belong to you, and that can belong to you. But actually, what Marxism really teaches the people in that situation is not that can belong to you, but that already belongs to you. You know, that is already rightfully yours. It's just been expropriated from you. It's been seized from you. It's already yours because it's the product of your labor. That is why the labor theory of value is so important in Marxist economic theory. And in fact, the theory of surplus value, which is much more, is employed much more today than the labor theory of value. As I said, it's very important in terms of the Sandinistas consolidating their hold in Nicaragua, and it's tossed around on college campuses and in the third world and so forth. It's a very important item of discussion and consideration. And yet, the theory of surplus value is based on the labor theory of value. It can't exist without it. Now let's consider the manufacturing process as Marx considered it. In other words, let's examine what the theory of surplus value is all about. According to Marx, there are three components that need to come together to give you a product. And those are raw materials, machinery, and labor. So Marx talked a lot about the textile industry in England. So let's use the textile industry as our example. Let's say that the raw material is the cloth, the machinery is the sewing machine, and the labor would be the sewing itself. So of course the product would be the shirt. And in order to grasp, let's attach a few numbers to this. Let's say that the cloth that is involved in making the shirt costs $1. The manufacturer has to pay $1 for the amount of cloth that's going into each shirt. Furthermore, let's talk about the sewing machine. Now we're getting into a very interesting area. According to Marx, the machinery can only contribute its own value, its own exchange value, into the production of the commodities. So let's say that the sewing machine is contributing $1 worth of its value every time that a shirt is produced. And let's say that the workers are being paid $2 apiece for the shirts. However, when this shirt goes to the market, it's being exchanged for a price of $7. Well, simple arithmetic shows that the costs involved are only $4, yet the price is $7. That means there's a difference of $3. This is what Marx called the surplus value. Now, where is this surplus coming from? Well, one possibility would be that this shirt is being sold for more than it's worth. It's actually only worth $4. It's being sold for more than it's worth, and that's where the extra $3 is coming from. However, the labor theory of value says that's impossible. Things cannot be sold for more than they're worth. Things can only be sold for their value. This is an important part of it. Marx said capitalism does not sustain itself by selling things for more than they're worth. No, the actual value of that is $7. It's that there's more value. One of these three components is putting in more than just this amount of value. There's something going on here, so he undertakes an investigation to find out where this additional value is coming from. So is it coming from the raw materials? No, not according to Marx. Capital invested in raw materials is what he called constant capital. You only get out what you put in. Same thing with the machinery. According to Marx, there's a sort of a magic law in operation. And that is that if the sewing machine costs $1,000, then it will transfer that $1,000 worth of exchange value into the products that you're making, at which time it will expire. And Marx says you'll have to take it out to the lumber room. Now this is actually some sleight of hand going on here. There's no real reason why that machine should transfer exactly its value into the products and then be exhausted. But Marx linked it up with the process of depreciation, and he said the capitalist would be depreciating at $1 for every shirt he made, so therefore there's no extra value coming from here. Therefore, by the simple process of deduction, the extra value, the surplus value, is coming here from the laborer. The laborer is actually doing more than $2 worth of labor, and yet he's only getting $2 in wage. In this case, his labor value would be $5. His wage is only $2, so there's this $3, which is taken by the capitalist. This is the surplus value. This is he calls it profit, and he tries to gloss over what he's doing. But actually, it really belongs to the laborer. Profit belongs to the laborer, and the laborer alone in the Marxist view. Nevertheless, it is seized by the capitalist, and this is essential capitalism. You can't have capitalism without this. So therefore, in capitalism, the laborer is always the victim, and the capitalist is always the criminal. There's no way around it. That's just the way the system works. So it's very, very dramatic, and Marx even goes so far as to pronounce this verdict of guilty and give the sentence of death, and the only way to do it is through the revolution. Well, it's exciting, and it's been very successful as propaganda, but as we pointed out, it's a total failure when you try to take this and somehow construct an economic system. In fact, it gives rise to a lot of different economic measures, none of which seem to be consistent and none of which seem to work. So let's go back and let's look at this theory and find out what are the essential flaws in the surplus value theory. Well, first of all, Marx is guilty of gross oversimplification. He looks at the manufacturing process, and he considers that there are machinery, labor, and raw materials going into the manufacturing process. But there are many, many other factors. There are many other contributions that have to be made to the manufacturing process. In fact, the capitalist is not just someone who pours money into a factory. Investment itself is a creative action. That one has to choose where to invest money. Research must be done, perhaps intuition. Ultimately, the investor is contributing his creativity to the process. There's management. There are secretaries. There are inventors of machines and engineers who make machines. There are those who research for the market. Raw material purchase itself is not such a simple thing. You have to research, purchase, get good quality things. If you have bad quality things, you'll lose your money. In other words, the manufacturing process is far more complex than Marx would have us understand. Furthermore, according to Marx, the value is already set when you manufacture the goods. But in fact, we know you still have to take that product to the market. According to the labor theory of value, the price is already prefixed, and therefore the capitalist's profit is already guaranteed. He's already assured of the profit. But we know that in reality, price is determined in the market, and there's nothing guaranteed. The manufacturer has to take his chances, and he has to deal with the factors of supply, demand, and quality if he expects to make a sale and turn a profit. Furthermore, even if there were only these three components in the manufacturing process, he still oversimplifies. He says that labor is the only source of profit. But in fact, what about raw materials and machinery? Marx says that raw materials and machinery are constant capital. Well, that's not correct. You could buy bad raw materials and lose all the money that you invested. And machinery itself is capable of generating profit, producing profit. For example, here's a machine that if Marx ever laid eyes on it, he would have to revise his theory, because there's no workers involved in this machine. It's just completely automated. It's making tape recorders in the Matsushita Electric Company. In fact, it's doing the work of 6 persons. By the way, according to the Matsushita Company, those 6 people were not fired but they got other jobs. Well, hopefully they got jobs that were more interesting than just putting together those tape recorders. Automation offers that possibility of relieving some of the tedious work that workers have had to do in the past. This is a very good example of that. This is an automatic welding machine, in other words, a robot welding machine. This particular one is in the Honda Motor Company. It does 130 welds in 45 seconds, a job that formerly required 30 people, 32 minutes. It's astonishing. Not only that, but climbing into the auto bodies and making spot welds is one of the jobs that the assembly line workers complained about the most into a factory. Investment itself is a creative action. That one has to choose where to invest money. Research must be done, perhaps intuition. Ultimately, the investor is contributing his creativity to the process. There's management. There are secretaries. There are inventors of machines and engineers who make machines. There are those who research for the market. Raw material purchase itself is not such a simple thing. You have to research, purchase, get good quality things. If you have bad quality things, you'll lose your money. In other words, the manufacturing process is far more complex than Marx would have us understand. Furthermore, according to Marx, the value is already set when you manufacture the goods. But in fact, we know you still have to take that product to the market. According to the labor theory of value, the price is already prefixed, and therefore the capitalist's profit is already guaranteed. He's already assured of the profit. But we know that in reality, price is determined in the market, and there's nothing guaranteed. The manufacturer has to take his chances, and he has to deal with the factors of supply, demand, and quality if he expects to make a sale and turn a profit. Furthermore, even if there were only these three components in the manufacturing process, he still oversimplifies. He says that labor is the only source of profit. But in fact, what about raw materials and machinery? Marx says that raw materials and machinery are constant capital. Well, that's not correct. You could buy bad raw materials and lose all the money that you invested. And machinery itself is capable of generating profit, producing profit. For example, here's a machine that if Marx ever laid eyes on it, he would have to revise his theory, because there's no workers involved in this machine. It's just completely automated. It's making tape recorders in the Matsushita Electric Company. In fact, it's doing the work of 6 persons. By the way, according to the Matsushita Company, those 6 people were not fired, but they got other jobs. Well, hopefully they got jobs that were more interesting than just putting together those tape recorders. Automation offers that possibility of relieving some of the tedious work that workers have had to do in the past. This is a very good example of that. This is an automatic welding machine, in other words, a robot welding machine. This particular one is in the Honda Motor Company. It does 130 welds in 45 seconds, a job that formerly required 30 people, 32 minutes. It's astonishing. Not only that, but climbing into the auto bodies and making spot welds is one of the jobs that the assembly line workers complained about the most. It's a very unpleasant and a difficult job. So that job has been taken over, and of course not just in Honda, but in General Motors and other American companies as well. That is now being done by robots, robot welding machines, more efficiently and more quickly than the workers were able to do. Now, whether those workers are laid off or whether they get other jobs in the company, there's really no economic law that determines that. That depends upon the policy of that company and the particular situation of that worker. There's no iron law that says that machines are continuously putting people out of work. In fact, the development of machines such as the machines necessary to make automobiles has created thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs. Machinery has created far more jobs than it has eliminated. This is a trend that Marx would have to face if he were alive today. And why is it that a machine can generate profit on a philosophical level? Ultimately, a machine simply amplifies the creative power of a human being. So if human labor can be profitable, then machine labor can also be profitable. But Marx was unable to recognize that. Essentially, all the machines which human beings make are extensions and amplifications of the human body. You know, the sound system is a good example. It amplifies the voice. The large machines which are necessary to make auto body parts are like extensions of the human body itself. Amplification of human potential, that's all that a machine does, really. In addition to oversimplifying, the Marxist view is inherently irresponsible in the myth that it creates of the capitalist. The capitalist is supposedly some kind of evil person who makes children work in horrible conditions, who makes people work in dangerous places, who creates sweatshops and so forth. And the only way that he can be dealt with is through revolution. He's got to be destroyed. This is the thrust of the Marxist message. But what Marx failed to understand is that the economic system itself can change. It can be reformed. It can evolve, if you will. It can go through all kinds of different processes. For Marx, it was a very static thing. It just had to be broken apart. He critiqued. He had certain legitimate critiques of the England of his day. But he didn't understand how England, in its economic system, and America and Europe and all the other countries, would be able to change and transform themselves. Furthermore, he didn't recognize the mobility within the system. After all, today's hot dog vendor actually may very well be a capitalist, and yet tomorrow he may progress. He may move on to something else. Marx didn't recognize that there would be this tremendous surge and growth of the middle class, of people who are able to do business for themselves. After all, if you're familiar with New York, this has a very familiar look to it. Today's sunglasses vendor who has to move every time that the police come by, tomorrow he may have his own jewelry store. And the street musician, he may become a recording company executive. There's that possibility for movement within the society. Marxism really fails to grasp this important point. And finally, Marx ignores the whole possibility of loss. He doesn't really take into consideration the risk that's involved. Profit is not automatic. Loss is possible. Somebody has to take a chance and put up the capital. In the Soviet Union, it's the state. The Soviet Union is an example of state monopoly capitalism. The state puts up the capital. Somebody has to. They may make a profit, they may lose. In the free world, various public and private investors have to put up the capital. In other words, the manufacturing process, if we want to break it down, we might talk about capital, management, and labor contributing together to make the products. Even once the product is made, it has to be taken to the market. There's a two-stage process. There's the production, where everyone joins together, contributes their creativity, and produces something. Then it has to go to the market, where the showdown occurs. It's in the market where the producer finds out whether or not he's going to be able to make the sale. So it wouldn't be a bad idea for him to say a few prayers before he takes the product to the market. Here we see our hot dog vendor praying that somebody will come and buy a hot dog, and sure enough, here's the capitalist realizing his sale. Good for him. Now he can make a profit. However, what is the profit after all? Profit is not a crime. Profit is something good. Profit is essentially the reward that society returns to all those who invest their creativity to increase the social wealth. In order for an economy to be productive, in order for an economy to move forward, people have to invest their creativity into things. By doing so, they increase the social wealth. Therefore, it's natural for society to return back some kind of reward to those who have contributed. For Marx, profit is a crime. It's very clear. Making a profit is a crime. This is the crime of the capitalist. However, if there's a crime in capitalism, it's not making a profit, but it might be the failure to return a fair share of that profit to all of those who are contributing their creativity. So this is an important aspect. The profit has to be, all those who contribute have to receive a share, a fair share of the profit. Well, of course, there's also the possibility of not making a profit. there's the possibility of a loss. So whoever expects to get a fair share of the profit had also better be willing to take a fair share of the risk. It's unrealistic to expect to share the gains and not be willing to also take part in the risk. However, this whole analysis is far beyond Marx's comprehension. It sort of goes beyond what he was able to do. Before we conclude, let's examine some of the very few words that Marx ever wrote regarding this so-called ideal society or communist society. Marx is mainly involved in critique against the status quo and agitating for revolution. However, in his text, Critique of the Gotha Program, he did say that in communism, each would receive according to his ability and each would contribute according to his needs. It's so nice that it almost sounds like poetry, and many people have been sort of drawn into believing that, oh yes, that's very nice, that would be the ideal. But what does this actually mean? Who's going to determine one's abilities? Who could determine the ability of someone like an Einstein? What if the State Planning Control Board decided that this gentleman should be a factory worker? Then all of that tremendous creative ability would be wasted. Furthermore, who can determine the needs? This is a very touchy question. We may feel like, well, yeah, there are certain necessities, and beyond those necessities, it's luxury. However, where does one draw that line? Maybe someone feels that I just can walk to work, but I feel I need a bicycle. Or maybe I feel I need a car. Or maybe I feel that my time is so important that I need a helicopter to get to work in Manhattan without wasting time. Who can say, well, no, that's a luxury and this is a necessity? Actually, it's impossible to determine. In fact, someone must have determined that for the Soviet ambassador to Grenada, it was a necessity to have a Mercedes. I'm sure that he needed to maintain his prestige as the representative of a very dignified sovereign nation. However, maybe some of the Soviet citizens might have disagreed with that. Who's going to be the arbiter? I suppose that if we could all get our instructions directly from God, we would be satisfied. However, if it's impossible for that to happen, then maybe we ourselves can be the judge. And indeed, this is the situation in a free enterprise economy. At least it's up to us to decide what we need and what we're capable of. But what if there's a third party that arbitrarily makes these decisions? That indeed is the situation in the Marxist world. It is the state which makes all kinds of determinations regarding necessity and ability. That would work fine if the human being was just a machine. It's ironic that Marxism in its philosophy ultimately denigrates man to the position of animal. And in its economics, it ultimately denigrates man to the position of machine. However, this goes very much against human nature. One, the natural desire for self-improvement. We've said that selfishness is a serious problem and ultimately is the cause of social evil. However, we're not referring to the desire for self-improvement. When we're talking about selfishness, as we've said, we're talking about a narrow perspective of self-benefit. The desire for self-improvement has to be recognized, and there have to be opportunities for individuals to improve themselves. Furthermore, the human nature is to be creative, and that demands freedom. Finally, we need motivation. And in a system where motivation is restricted or destroyed, you're not going to have prosperity and economic development. Ultimately, the free market system is a very good system right now. It offers great opportunities. In his text, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, Michael Novak writes, as at the heart of Judaism and Christianity is the recognition of sin, as at the heart of democratic capitalism is a differentiation of systems designed to squeeze some good from sinful tendencies. In other words, Novak the theologian is saying that the free market system is a very good system for sinful man. Because sinful man can use some motivation, needs some incentive, oftentimes is not willing to just give of himself for the benefit of the whole. So the most successful system that we've seen in terms of generating wealth and putting it into people's hands so that they can use it is a free market system. And yet we have to recognize that the system has been abused. in some cases grossly abused. But the root of the problem is not in the construction of the system itself, but rather in individuals' priority of values. And we've talked about selfishness as the lack of proper perspective. Therefore, we very much reject the idea that the solution to abuse and exploitation is violent destruction of the present system. That is not the key point. That is not going to make things better. And therefore, the theme of our conference over and over again will be the elevation of the human perspective within a framework of freedom, within a framework of free choice. And this we have given the name the internal revolution, as opposed to the external revolution. The revolution of the human being as opposed to the revolution of the system. And this is a theme that we're going to pursue tomorrow when we begin to introduce and clarify more completely what the CAUSA worldview is all about.
As William Ley points out, the essence of CAUSA is the need for an internal revolution. Unless people change, society cannot change. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin was successful in realizing an external revolution in Soviet Russia. But what has changed? In the next presentation, we will consider Lenin's impact upon Marxist ideology. Likewise, we will consider the results of Leninism in our world today. Please do join us.